Hey class, and welcome back. So this time we're going to start Unit 6, which is going to have a look at the muscular system of the human body. Now, the first thing we'll do is we'll quickly recap the different types of muscle we'll have, and you'll recall we studied this, or we breached on this really briefly in Unit 3, I think, when we talked about different types of tissue. So we've got three basic types of muscle. The first one is, of course, skeletal muscle. And these are the voluntary muscles that are connected to the bones of the skeleton. That's how it gets its name. And it's the ones that we can move freely ourselves. That's the voluntary part. They are heavily striated. Remember, they have those thick stripes that go perpendicular to the muscle fiber. And the muscle fibers themselves are very long. They're cylindrical in nature, and they're multinucleated. So they have lots of nuclei. These muscles are innervated, which means they have neurons or nervous tissue, nerve cells that are associated with them that allow us to cause their contraction. And skeletal muscles can contract and relax really, really quickly. The second type of smooth muscle there is, second type of muscle there is smooth muscle, and this is involuntary muscle. Okay, this is stuff that we can't control. It's controlled by parts of our brain that we don't have conscious control over. So we're going to find these muscles in the walls of our arteries. We're going to find it in hollow organs. We're going to find it in respiratory passageways, and the list goes on. Anything that requires movement inside of our body is going to require smooth muscle. The muscle fibers are quite small. Remember, they're kind of fat in the middle and tapered at each end. They don't have striations. They have a slow contraction and relaxation rate. They contract and then slowly relax, and they can also maintain contraction. So they're responsible for slowly moving things through our body. And a good example is peristalsis. And peristalsis is the rhythmic muscle contraction that will take food from the minute you swallow it through the esophagus and then through the different organs of the digestive system. So smooth muscles are responsible for that. And then the third muscle type that we talked about is the cardiac muscle. Again, this is involuntary muscle. We can't control it, and it's found in the walls of the heart. Okay, it is striated, like we'll see in the skeletal muscle. It contains only one nuclei per cell, and these muscle fibers, these cells, can actually branch, which forms a little bit more increased connection. They have specialized membranes that will allow electrical stimulation to pass through them quite quickly. Now, that's good because muscle contraction is controlled by the nervous system, which is usually, generally a flow of electric current through a cell. So having this specialized membrane and these short muscle fibers allow for better regulations on contraction of the heart, which of course makes our heart beat more efficiently. And if you look down here, there's a couple of pictures here that show each muscle fiber in tissue. Okay, so for the next little while, let's talk about the skeletal muscle. And first of all, let's talk about some of the functions. Now, first and foremost, when we think of skeletal muscle, we think of our ability to move, okay? And that's because the main role of skeletal muscle is to move the skeleton. So these muscle fibers are attached to the bone structures. And then when they contract, they change the length of the muscle fiber, which in turn, moves the bones. So that allows us to have our movement. Another thing that skeletal muscle does is maintain body posture. Some of the muscles we have, if we're standing up, for example, will be contracted, constantly. So a constant contraction is known as muscle tone. And muscle tone will allow us to maintain an upright posture. Remember, because if we're standing up, our body has to work against the forces of gravity. And in order to do that, we need to have muscles contracted so that we maintain our upright posture. And that's important. So generally, we'll find this constant contraction, in the large muscles that we find in our neck, our shoulders, our back, and our thighs. So that'll allow us to stand up upright despite gravity. Another thing that skeletal muscle does is it generates quite a bit of heat. Okay, when skeletal muscles contract, one of the things that they create, not only movement, but is also heat. because of the metabolism that happens in that cell. So this will help the body regulate our body temperature. So if you get really cold, for example, one of the things that will happen is you'll start to shiver. Now, shiver is a quick, constant contraction and relaxation of the skeletal muscles. And when this is happening, one of the things that's being produced besides that movement of shivering is this spin-off product, which is the heat. So shivering for a little while will generate a lot of heat, and it will help to warm you up. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail now about the structure of the skeletal muscle. So if you look at figure A, this is a pretty good summary of how these muscles come together. The first thing that we're going to do is we'll start right at the top up here with the muscle fiber itself. So that's the cell, the muscle cell. Those are the ones we looked at under the microscope in lab. Now, a bunch of these muscle fibers will come together, and they'll be organized into a bundle that we call a fascicle. Okay? So this picture right here shows a bunch of muscle fibers together, and that is one fascicle. Now, in order for them to be arranged together, they're bundled together by a couple of different layers of connective tissue. And those connective tissue each have a name. They're going to be connective tissue membranes. And depending on where the membrane is found, it's going to be a slightly different name because it's going to have a slightly different function. So just talking about the membranes now. The first one we have is the endomysium. Endomysium is this one right here. Now, the endomysium is going to be the one that's around a single fiber. So each fiber will have a membrane around it, which is called the endomysium. The second membrane we'll talk about is the perimysium. Now, each perimysium is going to surround a fascicle. Sorry about the spelling and the writing. So we have the endomysium, which surrounds the fiber, and then we have a group of fibers, and that's surrounded by the perimysium, and that's called a fascicle. And then when we have a group of fascicles together, that's surrounded by a membrane called the epimysium, and that's going to be holding together several fascicles. And you can see in the picture, the epimysium goes along the very outside of this particular muscle. Now, all of those connective tissue membranes are going to travel down the entire length of the fibers, right? So at the end, we're going to be left with, we're not going to have any more muscle tissue, but we're going to have connective tissue. And that connective tissue collectively forms into a tendon, which is a structure of connective tissue that joins a muscle fiber to the bone that we see down here. Okay? So that's how a muscle is organized. When we talk about the inner workings from the fiber to the fascicle to the entire muscle. And those are surrounded by 3 different connective tissue membranes. Okay, so for the rest of this video and for the next video, what we're going to be talking about is how a muscle cell works. So we're going to be talking about our first real in-depth physiology. Okay, we're going to be talking about biochemistry. We're going to be talking about stuff that happens on a molecular level inside a muscle fiber. So I'm pretty sure this will be new to most people. So take your time to make sure you wrap your head around this, because this is going to be the basis for some of the physiology that we're going to be talking about later on in the semester. All right, so the first thing we'll talk about when we talk about movement of muscle tissue is the motor unit. Okay, now a motor unit itself is a neuron. And a neuron is a cell of the nervous system. We haven't talked about the nervous system yet, but we're going to get a brief introduction right here. Okay, so a motor unit is a part of the muscle that's controlled by one cell of the nervous system, and that nervous system cell is called a neuron. So that's how this is going to be organized. Now, we can have small motor units, and these are going to be used for fine movements. So if you're manipulating something, with the tips of your fingers, we'll be using our small motor units for that. We'll also have large motor units, and these are used for much broader movements. So if you're running, for example, those are going to be innervated are controlled by a larger motor unit. Okay, so in order to understand how these muscle fibers work, we need to understand how the nervous system attaches to the muscle fiber. Okay, so we're going to be talking about two different types of tissues in the next few slides. Nervous tissue doesn't directly attach to other tissues. It comes close, and it comes really, really close where there's a tiny gap, a small space between the end of the nervous tissue and the effector, which in this case is going to be the muscle fiber. Now, that little tiny gap that we see between those two tissues is called a synapse. Okay, so a synapse is a space within the nervous system where either two neurons come close together, or a neuron and its effector comes close together. Now for this unit, when we're saying effector, we're going to be talking about the muscle fiber. Okay, so the neuromuscular junction, so the NMJ, that's the point where a nerve fiber will come in very, very, very close contact with a muscle fiber. Okay, so we'll call it the NMJ for now, but junction in English is a word that means where two things come together. So it could be a junction of a road, so two roads come together, that's a junction, or in this case it could become two tissues can come together, like the nervous system and the muscular system. Okay, so at this NMJ, the neuromuscular junction, we're first going to have a motor neuron. Now a motor neuron is a neuron, so it's from the nervous system, and it controls movement. So that's why we call it a motor neuron. The next thing we're going to have is a neurotransmitter. Now neurotransmitters are chemicals that we find in the nervous system that will take a message from one neuron across the synapse, so across that little tiny gap, to either another neuron or the effector cell, which in this case is going to be the muscle fiber. And the next thing we need are going to be a motor end plate. Now a motor end plate is going to be a place on the muscle fiber, so it's basically going to be the receptor for the neuron. Okay, it's where the neuron will make contact through the synapse. And at that motor end plate, we're going to have receptors for that neurotransmitter. Now when we're talking about muscle contraction, we're talking about probably one of the most common neurotransmitters in the body, and that's called acetylcholine. And it's so common that it's usually abbreviated as ACH. So whenever you see ACH, you're talking about acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter. Okay, that's a lot of text and a lot of words. Let's have a look at some pictures, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense to you. So let's look at this picture first. So if we look at B right here, first we're going to have our neuron. So this is our neuron. This is going to be taking signals from the nervous system, and it's going to be carrying it down to the effector. Now the effector in this case, this block right here, is going to be our skeletal muscle. Now if you notice, if you look closely at the picture, you'll see that right around the neuron there's that empty blue space. And hopefully you notice that. I'll take away the pen there. That's going to be our synapse. And if we come over here to the next picture, this area right here, the space that I've just colored in, that's going to be the synapse. So that's the space between the nervous system up here, the neuron, and the muscle fiber down here. So this is going to be the neuron, and this is going to be the muscle. Okay. Let me clear up some of that for us so we can see a little better. Okay, great. Now, we talked about the acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter. Well, this is the way that the acetylcholine is going to work. We'll have a receptor at the end of the neuron that has the acetylcholine. When the message comes down from the neuron, it will release the acetylcholine out into the synapse. The muscle fiber, the motor end organ, will have a receptor for the acetylcholine. So the acetylcholine will bind to the receptor, and it will cause that muscle to contract. And that's exactly how we wanted that particular physiological occurrence to happen. So The neuromuscular joint allows the motor neuron to stimulate the muscle fiber and become electrically excited. The action potential will stimulate the muscle contraction, and that's what